Farma, Abraco, né, a todos os presentes e aos speakers, né, muito obrigado pela disponibilidade, né, de compartilhar com a gente a experiência de vocês. É uma honra tê-los aqui e espero que todos aproveitem o evento. Muito obrigado.
Então, bom dia. Agradecemos a todos aqui a presença. É um evento muito importante aqui para a Interfarma. Então, hoje é o nosso segundo módulo, né, de dados de vida real. Hoje é o nosso módulo 2A, né? O nosso será dividido em dois módulos, 2A e 2B, que vai trazer fontes e qualidade dos dados de vida real. Então, temos aqui hoje 4 speakers. Então, a Grace Crane, que ela é líder de política regulatória internacional para a RWD na Roche, faz parte de uma série de grupos externos de orientação e trabalho, incluindo a ISPOR, RWD Transparent Initiative, protocolo de RWD e grupo de trabalho, CIOMS, sobre diretriz de RWD e RWE. Bem-vinda, Grace. RWE, principal cientista de dados de mundo real da RWD Enabling Platform e cientista RWD principal no CD20 e CD3, Biospecifics Program, na área terapêutica de hematologia na Roche. Temos também Christopher Tourney, vice-presidente corporativo para assuntos regulatórios em projetos de diabetes e obesidade na Novo Nordisk, e o Alexander Lidi, diretor sênior em epidemiologia global na AbbVie. Lidera uma equipe global de epidemiologistas que está sendo desenvolvido soluções para dados de mundo real e necessidade de evidências. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Aqui algumas orientações do nosso evento. Esse módulo, na verdade, o nosso workshop de RWD e RWE conta com tradução simultânea, português-inglês, inglês-português. Então, para selecionar esse item, tem um ícone aqui embaixo para vocês podem escolher. A sessão de perguntas e respostas será realizada nos 20 minutos finais, então elas podem ser feitas ao vivo, pelo microfone, e também pelo chat. Por favor, façam as suas perguntas pelo chat em português, para que possamos aqui ser melhor na organização e na logística do evento. Então, é isso, agradeço a todos. Iniciamos, então, a apresentação com o doutor Alexander. Por favor.
E todo mundo consegue ver os meus slides? Tá.
Sim, perfeito.
Tá.
Sim, perfeitamente.
Tá. Bom dia a todos. Gostaria de agradecer a Interfarma e Anvisa por essa oportunidade em compartilhar com vocês sobre o tópico Real World Evidence, ou RWE, as oportunidades e os desafios em construir fortes evidências científicas usando os dados da vida real para a tomada de decisões regulatórias. Antes de iniciar, gostaria de informar que trabalho na empresa AbbVie e as opiniões compartilhadas são as minhas e nem sempre refletem as da AbbVie. Se vocês só se lembrarem de uma coisa da minha apresentação, devia ser o conceito de fit for purpose, ou adequado ao propósito, em relação à pergunta ou objetivo do estudo, aos dados, ao desenho e aos métodos de análise e aos resultados ou evidências. Na minha opinião, existem 3 oportunidades ou desafios na geração de evidências usando dados da vida real. As oportunidades ou desafios começam com os dados, a relevância e validade da fonte de dados, se temos confiança na captura de elementos de dados e desfechos dos estudos, e o processamento de dados brutos, o trabalho para organizar dados não estruturados e dados em tempo real. A segunda oportunidade tem a ver com o desenho do estudo e os métodos de análise. o desenho do estudo que é fit for purpose, ou adequado ao propósito, e métodos que consideram os vieses, transparência dos métodos e análises, e que os resultados podem ser replicados. E para finalizar, temos a oportunidade de ter uma aceitação mais ampla por pesquisadores, agências regulatórias, patrocinadores e as empresas farmacêuticas. Também temos desafios na aceitação dentro das nossas empresas. Os colegas entendem muito bem o desenho de ensaios clínicos e ainda estão aprendendo sobre como utilizar dados do mundo real. A aceitação também pode melhorar através de padronizações e harmonizações nas recomendações e guias, regulamentações de RWE entre as regiões. Também com propostas que são exemplos de sucesso e a tecnologia. Um bom ponto de partida é identificar a pergunta que queremos responder com o estudo. Que decisão estamos esperando que a agência tome baseada em RWE? Está relacionada com segurança, efetividade ou eficácia, efetividade quando usamos RWD ou outra decisão? Já vimos este slide na semana passada, mas vale mencionar novamente, pois mostra uma evolução importante da FDA, que se iniciou há 3 anos atrás e será atualizado em dezembro deste ano. Neste framework de RWE, a FDA chama a atenção que os dados, o desenho do estudo e a evidência ou a pergunta do estudo precisam ser relevantes e suficientes e fit for purpose para a tomada de decisão regulatória. Mas já usamos dados da vida real em farmacovigilância para avaliar a segurança e o perfil benefício-risco de novas terapias com a EMA e a FDA. A INCEP fornece orientações sobre padrões e métodos para os estudos de farmacoepidemiologia e farmacovigilância, e como vimos semana passada, a EMA está evoluindo uma série de projetos para aumentar a qualidade e acesso à fonte de dados entre os países na Europa para a tomada de decisões. A FDA também usa o sistema Sentinel para avaliação de segurança de medicamentos usando várias fontes de dados nos Estados Unidos e estão expandindo o acesso a novos tipos de dados e novos métodos analíticos, como, por exemplo, a inteligência artificial para aprimorar os recursos de vigilância em segurança. As agências globais estão aprimorando e promovendo estratégias de epidemiologia para avaliação de segurança e efetividade. Aqui vemos exemplos das agências nos Estados Unidos, Canadá e Japão. E na Europa, o grande esforço para organizar a rede de dados para a tomada de decisões regulatórias entre países se chama Darwin EU e começou este ano. O exemplo aqui ajuda a ilustrar um desafio principal que começa com os dados. Uma fonte de dados da vida real são os arquivos eletrônicos de pacientes tratados em clínicas, ou EHR ou EHR. Mas temos que lembrar que esses arquivos representam dados coletados durante a prática clínica de rotina. Em outras palavras, não são coletados e organizados bem para pesquisa. Especialmente em oncologia, muitas vezes precisamos acesso aos resultados de estudos laboratórios. Muitas vezes estes detalhes não são estruturados e precisam ser abstratos, por exemplo, resultados de análises genéticas ou de biomarcadores. São muitas vezes documentos escaneados ou em forma de PDF. De importância crítica será compreender e documentar o processamento de dados brutos e o processo de abstração. Este slide mostra 2 exemplos de métodos para preencher lacunas de dados clínicos. O primeiro processo na esquerda compara abstração tradicional com revisores humanos contra a combinação de tecnologia como Natural Language Processing e experiência médica para revisar e organizar os detalhes sobre, por exemplo, um relatório de teste de algum biomarcador. À direita do slide mostra o esforço possível nos Estados Unidos, por exemplo, que protege privacidade, mas também permite a ligação ou linkage entre 2 bancos de dados no nível do paciente para obter mais informação sobre a jornada do paciente. O algoritmo usa elementos de dados do paciente como nome, data de nascimento, e fornece uma identificação única do paciente que podemos usar para achar este mesmo paciente em outro banco de dados. No desenho do estudo usando dados da vida real, é importante considerar a relevância da fonte dos dados e para entender quais são os vieses potenciais. Se a fonte de dados, em outras palavras, da clínica, hospital ou plano de saúde, contém os detalhes da jornada do paciente relevante para a doença e os resultados de interesse. Se é possível confirmar antes do estudo se os elementos de dados estão disponíveis para definir a coorte e outra informação importante para o estudo dessa doença, ou se for necessário, talvez, para conduzir outros estudos de validação ou esforços como a ligação para outro banco de dados. Se a fonte de dados também é representativa da população, do ambiente clínico, que contém bastante paciente suficiente para o poder do estudo e que a informação sobre os pacientes é confiável ao longo do tempo. O exemplo aqui ajuda a ilustrar alguns desafios a ver com dados de claims, ou seguros de planos de saúde. No Brasil, existem 2 sistemas de saúde. O Sistema de Saúde Público, o SUS, que cobre todos os indivíduos em território brasileiro, ou 2, o Sistema de Saúde Privado. O SUS possui uma das maiores fontes de dados com claims de sistemas de saúde de todo o mundo, chamado DataSUS. A vantagem de DataSUS é que oferece a oportunidade de coleta de evidências da população do Brasil com um tamanho suficiente e grande para estudos, já que 75% da população usa o SUS. Nossa análise recente em artrite reumatológica, a gente identificou, por exemplo, 350 mil pacientes durante 10 anos de estudo. Podemos obter informações sobre tratamentos e medicamentos utilizados, sobre o sequenciamento de terapias no sistema, diferenças por estado ou região e modelos econômicos. A limitação, assim como acontecem com os dados de claims de planos de saúde, é que os dados são utilizados principalmente para fins administrativos. Assim, estão sujeitos a erros de classificação, alterações na política e perda de segmento de pacientes que usam o sistema privado. Reconhecendo os desafios, usando fontes de dados da vida real, que nem planos de saúde, Quando estamos planejando e desenhando um estudo de farmacoepidemiologia, consideramos vários tipos de erros sistemáticos. A classificação incorreta é um desafio comum nos estudos de farmacoepidemiologia, e o viés de detecção precisa o desenvolvimento e uso de códigos e algoritmos válidos para definir com precisão a doença, a exposição e outros endpoints. O viés do tempo imortal é um problema comum nos estudos de coortes. Pode ser introduzido quando queremos comparar 2 ou mais grupos. Quer dizer que os dados de pacientes são categorizados como expostos em um grupo onde o tempo está incorretamente contado e não contado como dependente do tempo. No planejamento de estudos, temos estratégias para lidar com o viés de classificação incorreta, que nem estudos de validação na fase do desenho, ou usando regras de censura e data de índice na fase de análises. Este slide mostra informação de uma reportagem da empresa ECHO de alguns meses atrás. Ano passado, foi mostrado que 75% das terapias aprovadas pela FDA incluíram um estudo RWE, em comparação ao ano 2019, com 49%. 12% eram evidências substanciais e 60% eram evidências de suporte. Mas 20% das submissões da RWE, a FDA determinou que a evidência não foi adequada ou aceitável. Mas que tipo de pergunta está tentando ser respondida com RWE? Já sabemos que podemos trabalhar para responder as perguntas de segurança usando RWE, mostrado na esquerda desse slide. A fronteira mais recente, mostrada no lado direito do slide, é onde os dados eletrônicos da vida real podem ajudar a informar sobre a efetividade de terapias para aprovações novas ou condicionais, ou para novas indicações. Mas há precedente da FDA no uso de dados históricos de clínicas, hospitais e de registros para informar a tomada de decisão regulatória. Por exemplo, até mostrado desde 1987, particularmente para doenças raras ou indicações órfãs, onde ensaios randomizados não são possíveis. A maioria, mostrado na primeira linha em cima, representa a coleção primária ou dados de registros de doenças. O caso exemplar de blinatumomab, que é sempre contado, usa dados históricos porque o padrão de tratamento na doença não evoluiu por décadas. O primeiro exemplo de dados eletrônicos usados para a decisão de FDA aconteceu em dezembro de 2017. Um outro exemplo é da Pfizer, com palbociclib para um tratamento para homens com câncer de mama, no canto direito embaixo. Este é um bom exemplo de adequado ao propósito, ou fit for purpose, porque usaram 3 bancos de dados diferentes para responder 3 perguntas distintas. Com estes exemplos de sucesso, até a presente data, a FDA menciona que as decisões de aprovações tiveram o suporte de RWE, mas poderiam ter sido feitas até sem esse tipo de evidência. E a maioria dos estudos RWE são usados como referência para contextualizar os ensaios clínicos. Podemos aprender muito, talvez até mais do que os sucessos dos exemplos de estudos considerados inadequados pela agência regulatória. Os resultados de selinexor, por exemplo, em mieloma, foram considerados inconclusivos pela FDA. O que poderia ser feito de forma diferente? Planejamento combinando o plano de RWE ao lado do ensaio clínico, critérios de inclusão e exclusão aplicados aos dois estudos, com alinhamento das datas de índice para evitar o viés de tempo imortal, explorar a oportunidade de dados de controle externo das mesmas clínicas do ensaio, e envolvimento com os reguladores cedo no processo. Já vimos uma mensagem parecida de mim deste slide também. Quais são os componentes principais que nos ajudam a determinar se o RWE é adequado e relevante para a decisão? A relevância e confiança dos dados, o desenho e métodos de análise, mas também, bem importante, é a pergunta: existem algumas recomendações para avaliar se o estudo é adequado a fim de responder à pergunta. Por exemplo, o guia Picote e o Target Trial. Sobre o Target Trial, ele pode auxiliar no desenho do ensaio randomizado hipotético para responder às questões que o estudo RWE pretende resolver. Uma publicação recente do professor Schneeweiss, da empresa Aetion e da Universidade de Harvard, fornece um guia básico para a avaliação das evidências de dados do mundo real. E no planejamento de um estudo, para responder uma pergunta sobre efetividade, o Centro Duke Margolis possui um white paper do ano passado que pode ajudar. Começamos com a decisão se for um estudo para complementar como referência e comparação mais indireta, ou se for uma análise para comparar diretamente e medir o efeito do tratamento. O que vai ser bem crítico ao sucesso vai ser demonstrar a comparabilidade dos coortes, se são da mesma população, do mesmo ambiente clínico, mostrar o efeito das regras do ensaio de inclusão, exclusão mais subjetivas a ver com decisões médicas que não são possíveis na vida real, e a variabilidade dos dados para estudo, por exemplo, a frequência de testes clínicos na vida real. Enfim, quais são as considerações para RWE ser fit for purpose ou adequado ao propósito e relevantes para decisões, que a evidência será adequada para responder à questão científica e regulatória, que os dados e a fonte de dados são válidas e contêm os detalhes clínicos suficientes para a jornada do paciente, e que os dados são confiáveis e o processamento de dados brutos e os métodos são bem documentados e podem ser replicados. E também que os resultados são consistentes com outros estudos sobre a doença, talvez outros estudos de outros países, ou usando outras fontes de dados, e que diferenças podem ser explicadas. E, finalmente, que as decisões regulatórias em base de RWE podem ser feitas de forma eficiente. Então, muito obrigado.
Obrigada, Alexandre.
Bom dia.
Grace, por favor.
Ô, Cadu, tudo bem? A gente não tem interesse em...
Thank you very much, and thank you, Alex, for that excellent introduction. So let me share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my slides. Okay, so I think, okay, perfect. Yeah, so I think Alex kind of gave you a very good sort of insight into all of the issues that we are trying to address in terms of quality of data. And today my discussion and my presentation is focused on what are the global initiatives and the tools that are being created or are in place for addressing the quality of real-world data to enable it to be used for regulatory decision-making. And just to say, I work for Roche Pharmaceuticals, and I work in the as a regulatory policy topic lead, as was explained earlier. You all kind of heard that the key problem statement is this, that there can be many issues with real world data, but when you kind of think about the main issues, one of it is that there is a variable quality of data, and also there is also a lack of widely accepted criteria to assess the quality of this data. And so in today's presentation, what I've tried to do is I've tried to think about the solutions and tools that are being developed to address these issues, and specifically in 3 different ways. So thinking of the data quality, so when each data element is assessed, how do you assess the quality of that data? What is the research quality for these studies? So real world data studies need to be assessed in terms of how the analysis has been conducted and how transparent the methodology is, and also the evidence that's produced from this data and whether that is fit for purpose. You heard a lot about fit for purpose data from Alex, and so we talk about this too in terms of the evidence quality for decision making. I think, you know, I don't want to repeat what Alex said, but just to flag that the data is in the blue box, we've got data coming from what we call traditional settings. So this is data from registries, data from electronic health records, and data from insurance and billing claims. But I think what's interesting now is that the data is also coming to us from non-traditional settings. And by this specifically, we mean data that's coming from patient-generated devices. For instance, there are wearables. People have smartwatches. So there's sensor data coming from this. There's also apps that are available for recording patient-reported outcomes. So these are what we term non-traditional settings, or patient-generated health data. And so we want to be able to understand how the data quality, what the data quality looks like for traditional settings, but also how much of it can be extrapolated into the non-traditional settings as well. We saw that, you know, there are many different data sources available. We know that for each research question, we can actually think about using different data sources to answer different questions. And that's what the blue box indicates here, that if it's data that represents routine care, then we need to look at a specific data source. For instance, we need to look at claims databases. If we want to look at data that is, you know, has clinical detail, then we might need to delve more into disease registries that's capturing this data. So it's a very bespoke way of creating these real-world data studies, if you like, which then presents the challenge of variability within the different data sources. The other point to consider is this whole area of retrospective and prospective data. And that's what this slide shows here. This is just a quick summary slide that shows you that the study designs are different based on whether the data is retrospective, and this is data that has been collected before, and data that is prospective. If you like, what that does is it gives you a very different quality between the two types of studies. So the retrospective studies are being done on data sources that have not been designed to capture data for research purposes, whereas for prospective data, we have an opportunity to design a study similar to a clinical trial with an ECRF, with informed consent. We can build in source verification if needed. So you can see that these two are very different in terms of data quality. So Alex also mentioned linkage that's needed. Now, quite often we find that the original data source is good, but if we link it to a data source where there is lots of missing data, then that brings down the quality of the data as well. So there are many different considerations as we go through designing these studies and how we structure our methodology. And this is just a slide to show that real world data, all of this data that comes in needs some kind of curation or processing in order to be able to deliver evidence. But at each stage, we have different questions or different trustworthiness issues, if you like, that we need to address. So when we look at data, the different elements, we want to understand how the data is collected. If we want to look at how the research quality, then we want to understand how the data is processed. So how is the data organized? How is it processed, and how is it being submitted as in the dossier? And then finally, the evidence quality. The evidence that's coming from this data, is that reliable? Is that something that you can trust to answer the question that you have in the first place? So in terms of data quality, just to quickly outline a few additional things, in addition to what Alex already stated, that we need to make sure that the data is captured consistently, and also that there are predefined rules for abstraction of both structured and unstructured data. And as Alex showed in his one of his slides, that with electronic health records, a lot of the data that we need is actually in the unstructured space. So we need to be able to extract this data in a way that is consistent and in a predefined manner. So quite often, one of the tools that's available for us is a data dictionary. And a data dictionary gives you an understanding of what the data contains and how it's captured to some extent. Then we also want to think about the standardized definitions that are being used for key outcomes and measures wherever it's feasible. A very good example is the discussion that we often have with performance status. In some EHRs, they record it as an ECOG performance status. This is for oncology. In some other electronic health records, it's Karnofsky performance status that's recorded, and then there may be others as well. So if we are doing a study where we're using performance status, then of course we have to understand how these different measures, if you like, relate to each other and whether they are comparable. So that's one example of needing standardized definitions. The other issue here is also the data checks. How often is the data checked for range and consistency? That's important. And also, if you have a data check, then is there an audit trail available? And this becomes a key issue if there is no audit trail available. And you all may remember a couple of months ago that a couple of papers had to be pulled from the New England Journal because there was no audit trail available for the data source that was being used in these studies. So that's an important aspect of this data as well. And also just to say that when you think about outcomes of interest, we need sufficient and reliable information. For instance, you want to look at overall survival in a study, then the death data has to be available in that particular data source. Quite often we have found that the information on death dates is not reliable. So how do we overcome that? The other issue is the necessary confounding variables that are available. If you're looking at a study in lung cancer, then you want to be able to bring information on smoking in. Otherwise, it's a key variable for these types of analysis. And the final point here is you think about what I've called product of interest. So if you're looking at treatments, if you're looking at comparative studies, you're looking at standard of care versus a new intervention, then that particular treatment of interest has to be available within the registry that you're looking at. A really good example that we have found is a treatment registry that's been set up in Italy, and how they capture treatments of interest. So those are some of the issues that we wanted to flag in terms of data quality, in addition to what has been already flagged. And just to talk a little bit about, so I mentioned, some global initiatives. So this is one of them. This is an organization called the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, and they are US-based. They are the policy think tank for the FDA, and they're very keen to identify practical solutions. And every year they choose a topic, and recently they have brought out some very interesting white papers, and they're freely available on their website. And a couple of them very useful here that I flagged, which is talking about real-world data quality and relevancy, and also the framework for regulatory use as well. So it's definitely worth looking into these tools. So just to quickly summarize on one of the papers that's talking about real-world data quality and relevancy, I think Alex covered a lot of this already in terms of what we're looking for in terms of data relevancy, and also in terms of data quality. So these are just the additional information that's in the white paper, all the time driving towards fit for purpose data. And that's what we want. We want to be able to say that the data that we have answers the question that we're posing of the data. And again, on the tools front, when I look, there are a number of different tools that are available to assess data, to assess the quality. So there are two here that I have flagged. One is called the GRACE checklist. And this was actually created specifically by a number of researchers who were very keen to understand, how do we evaluate the quality in observational studies? So the checklist is very simple, and it consists of 11 questions that you can look at, some of them related to the study plan, and some of it related specifically to the analysis. So that's one tool that's available. The other one that's available is a checklist called Strobe, and this is a little bit more, it's more of a reporting template, and it's 22-item checklist of essential items that you want to report on when you're sharing studies, results from either cohort, cross-sectional, or case control studies, which are the typical study designs that we use. So let's now look at research quality and what that means. Essentially, we're talking about the design, the operation, and the analysis of the study. So we're no longer looking specifically at the individual data variables. We're one level higher. So we're looking at the study. And here I flagged 3 different criteria, if you like. The first one is to have a pre-specified study protocol and an analysis plan. The second is to think about a transparent methodology for the analysis, and also an opportunity to pre-register study protocols and reporting templates. And what we mean by that is that there's an opportunity to kind of, a little bit like clinicaltrials.gov, there's an opportunity to kind of deposit your study protocol. Now, why do we believe in this transparency? It's important to have transparency which drives trustworthiness, because transparency alone will not improve the quality of the data, but it will allow regulators and HTA bodies to assess the quality of the data. And that's what improves the trustworthiness. It allows the regulators to ask whether the results that we have actually reflect the pre-specified questions and the methods. And importantly, when there is transparent reporting, it can also facilitate the replication of results and reproducibility of studies. And as you know, this is an important principle that runs through all of scientific research. So what we have here is another global initiative. This is a consortium, if you like, approach where there is ISPOR, which is the International Society for Pharmaceutical Outcomes Research, working with ISPI, who are the epidemiological group. Also, again, working with Duke Margolis, driving the health policy, and also the National Pharmaceutical Council. It is also to flag that this is a committee, if you like, that includes health authorities, but also HTA bodies. And the main aim is to drive, is to build trust through transparency. So it's called the Real World Evidence Transparency Initiative. And one of the outputs, if you like, is to implement an effective study registration process that does so. They have created a white paper. Again, it's called the Roadmap to Transparency, to establish a culture of transparency in real-world evidence studies, and to report these studies using study registration. And you can look at the paper, and you can understand the roadmap a little bit more. And I just wanted to flag that they have also created a specific study site where you can register real-world evidence studies. It's interesting aspect of this website is that there's an opportunity to embargo the protocol. So what we mean by that is that the access is available only to selected parties. So it will be the sponsor as well as the health authority that can have access to this protocol during the embargo period. And once the embargo is lifted, once the study is completed, it is made public. What it also allows you to do is the entries are badged, so they have a time and date stamp, which then supports publication for high-tier journals as well. There are other initiatives that are also happening in this space, which is around harmonization. So there are a number of different protocol templates that are available for real-world data. And one of the key issues that has always been flagged to us is every health authority has said that every pharmaceutical company, every sponsor, every academic have their own protocol. So they spend a long time looking for the information. So we're trying to ease that off as well by creating a common protocol and reporting template. And then finally, the evidence. These are my last few slides. Just to say, we spoke about the data considerations and the method considerations, but the regulatory context becomes really important as well. And this is the clinical context feeds into the regulatory context. And the two are really important when we're considering what type of data to use, what type of methods to use, which again helps us with our enabling trust in the data. I just wanted to end on this note, which is how are EMA addressing this whole issue around confidence or trustworthiness in this type of data coming from registries. So the biggest challenge has always been that, that like every other country, there's always been challenges with existing registries. So what they have done is they have done a number of different interventions, if you like. So there's a discussion paper that is freely available and has been published on what are the methodological and operational considerations on the use of patient registries. They do a workshop, so where they invite industry sponsors, academics to participate. They also have what's called a qualification procedure for registries, and also guidelines on how you can do studies within these registries. And I'm just going to talk just quickly about a qualification procedure that is that they have done for registries. So the first qualification procedure, qualified EMA registry, was in 2018, and since then they have qualified a number of other registries as well. And what this does is it enables stakeholders to utilize these qualified registries because they know that it is satisfactory for specified regulatory studies. And so marketing authorization holders can actually utilize these qualified registries, if you like, as a source of data and a number of different post-authorization safety studies or post-authorization effectiveness studies have also been done in these registries. And I'll end with this slide here just to say, we talk about increasing the quality of the data. There are a number of checklists and other tools that are available. We want to increase the transparency of the real-world data studies. We talked about the pre-registration, making the documentation clear, and qualifying potentially as a tool to enable better data quality. And then finally, this is the last bullet, is where things are still evolving. So this is a very new area. So how do we move towards data standards and harmonization? In the US, there is an open source code called M-Code, and they talk about minimal common oncology data elements that allow data harmonization across electronic health records. So the idea being, if you pick a few elements and try to harmonize, you get a better chance at harmonization. In Europe, there are what's called common data models available, and they're also thinking about common minimal common data sets as well for rare diseases. So you can see this is a very fluid and dynamic area, but I will stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Muito obrigada, Grace. Nossa próxima apresentação, Dr. Christopher, por favor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's really an honor to be speaking in front of you today and share some of our thoughts on using patient registries and how they can support regulatory decision making. So you just heard two excellent presentations by Alex and Gracie, and I will dive into the application of using the patient registries for regulatory purposes. So let me start with the conclusion. Real-world evidence is already being used for regulatory decision making, and it's about embracing broader data sources. So on the left, you see a lot of regulatory agencies and universities have already shared their thoughts and frameworks that enable this expanded use of data sources. In the middle, you can see the regular work of a regulatory affairs professional in a company, and it is to address the regulatory question and then know what are the data sources available, and then embracing the real world data, and also knowing the methods and designs and what the potential use cases are. Just as you just heard from Gracie, that you have to really look into the details before you apply it and whether it's fit for purpose. And to quote one of my heroes, the former Scientific Advice Working Party chair from EMA, Rob Hemmings, let's not pretend that it's easy, but it's a journey that we should walk down together to support better decision making and also support patients. So let me start with the definition. According to the definition, then a registry is an organized system that uses observational study methods to collect uniform data to evaluate specified outcomes for a population, that being defined by a particular disease, condition, or exposure, and serving to answer a predetermined question. It's called many names, so if you hear clinical registries, hospital-based registries, population registries, then it's multiple terms for the same concept. So one of the first use case I will share with you comes from EMA. So EMA has a patient registry initiative that looks into how they can use high quality patient registries and make valuable contributions to the evaluation and monitoring of medicines for public health benefits. This is facing, of course, is based on facing a numerous issues with the current way we're doing registries. So coordination between ongoing initiatives at national and international levels, harmonized protocols, scientific methods, data structures, data sharing, and long-term sustainability of registries. And some of the principles Gracie and Alex laid out also apply here. So EMA's strategy is to bring together stakeholders to increase the use of existing patient registries for regulatory decision-making. And they also support an authorization process, as you saw, to facilitate the new registries and can agree on standard methodology approaches so that they can be used for broader purposes. So, and a really important step from a regulatory agency to lay the foundation for using registries for regulatory decision-making. So the first step when you establish any kind of registry is to start with the question. So what are you trying to answer? Is it to understand the disease or condition? Is it to learn about the population behavioral patterns and link it to the development of the disease? Is it to develop therapeutics, so informing the safety profile in a real-world setting, expanding the population and so forth, monitoring outcomes, study best practices, or develop research hypotheses? All of those questions will relate to a different setup of registry, and you really have to have that in mind when setting it up. Furthermore, understanding what level do you want the answer on? Is it on a local level, national, or international? Can it be bridged to other populations or countries, or is it specific to the current healthcare system? So the second case study I want to bring to your attention is the Canadian Pediatric Weight Management Registry, which was established with an aim of improving quality of weight management across Canada. And furthermore, also identify which factors influence the success of participants in weight management programs. So this is an example of a national registry in children which aim to characterize the comorbidities and the risk factors of comorbidities, and finally follow the disease over an 8-year time horizon. So very specific, and it can be used to inform drug development across weight management programs. So very important information to use for companies, for researchers, for authorities, to actually learn about the disease so we can enrich them properly, knowing what are the risk factors and comorbidities, and then also follow it over time so we understand the disease better. There are 4 important components which drive the successful build of a registry. First is the well-designed technology to capture, store, maintain, and report data, which is crucial for the validity and the interpretation of the outcome. So as you saw from Gracie, it requires new type of technology, scanning through electronic health records, linkage, and so forth. Not something that we are all used to in our randomized clinical trials. Next is a strong collaboration with researchers. which is needed to ensure high quality research data. Next is partnership with stakeholders, which is crucial, that being public organizations, authorities, and other pharmaceutical companies. Here I can mention that, for example, Novo Nordisk is part of a medullary thyroid carcinoma MTC registry with all other companies who have GLP-1 drugs on the market. So instead of us replicating the efforts, coming together, designing the research question, which we all share based on the class effects, is really important aspect of patient registries. And finally, the enrollment and participation. So here it's important to acknowledge that this often runs over a long time period. So an active and participation and growing the membership, constant communication is really key to getting the high quality data at the end of the registry. And the final example I will share with you is an example from Novo Nordisk, where we as a stakeholder are establishing a registry to uncover the cardiovascular benefits in a wider range of people living with type 2 diabetes. We have, together with Oxford University, announced that we'll conduct Ascent Plus, building on Oxford University's Ascent registry trial, exploring the use of aspirin and omega-3 fatty acids in type 2 diabetes in the UK health system. Here, the investigation is on using oral semaglutides in type 2 patients with no prior history of cardiovascular events. The study will enroll 20,000 patients at age 55 or above and will be randomized to either oral semaglutide or placebo on top of standard of care. And the trial is event-driven. So here we're using our totality of evidence for our Rybelsus compound, and if successful, use this both for medical communication and potentially indication seeking to expand the cardiovascular indication from patients with prior CV risk factors in our standard cardiovascular outcome trial to broaden the population to also patients without prior history of CV events based on this innovative trial design. Here, Oxford University is the sponsor and are conducting the trial in collaboration with Novo Nordisk. So truly a different kind of setup than a traditional randomized clinical trial. So there are a number of logistical aspects which we have learned that needs to be considered before a registry is established. So while collaborating with Oxford University, who have done tremendous work in trying to figure out how to work with the electronic health records in the national healthcare system in UK. And some of these boxes you already heard from the previous speakers, but they all carefully have to be considered before establishing it, and it's constantly under construction. Because once a registry is established, things can happen, and you need to conduct frequent health checks to ensure that the requirements are still met. For example, when there's a new therapy introduced or the medical treatment practice is changing, then the registry might need to be adapted or stopped as it's no longer valid for the intended purpose. So very important to not just start, but actually follow it through the course of the registry. Then another important aspect is, of course, the standardization of data collection, which is critical to ensure the success. You heard that from the previous speakers, and it's even more critical when trying to apply it in a submission to authorities, as collecting the data standards or combining it with other sources is really critical to look at the totality of evidence. So whatever purpose it's been collected for needs to be considered. The format, how it's being stored, that is really key for the successful use of registries in regulatory decision making. Finally, I will just repeat that everybody's getting ready to use real-world data and connecting the evidence from patient registries to answer key regulatory and scientific questions. The authorities have initiated frameworks and guidances and methodology. The industry is focusing on the regulatory question and ensuring the validity of the real data, the methods, and the design. And finally, we need to work together to make this work, and let's not pretend it's easy. Thank you very much.
Vai para as cabeças, não vai para você.
Obrigada, Christopher. Obrigada, Christopher. Nossa próxima apresentação. Ashwini, por favor.
Thank you. I hope everyone is able to see my screen. Greetings to everyone. My name is Ashwini Shivare, and I am a principal data scientist in the real world data function within global product development at Roche. I'll be speaking regarding extrapolation of foreign real world data. We define foreign real world data as real world data from a different region or geography than that under consideration for a given regulatory decision making. And how can such foreign real world data be useful for a given regulatory decision making? I would like to thank the organizers for this workshop, as well as participants for their time today. Over the course of last many years, regulatory authorities have embraced the increasing role of real-world data and real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. The agenda for today's workshop, and specifically the Module 2 of this workshop, span a variety of topics related to real-world data and its use from a regulator's perspective. In keeping with ANVISA's mission and vision, appropriate use of real-world data is relevant to protect and promote the health of the population, as well as to maintain excellence globally in the field of regulation and health control. We had insightful presentations until now in this workshop regarding the quality of real-world data. If available real-world data can meet the expectations of a regulator and is complementing the evidence generated from clinical trials, then such real-world data will inform the regulatory decision. To date, as we know, real-world data has been considered supportive evidence at best to inform regulatory decisions concerning the efficacy of a drug product for a given indication. The use of real-world data for regulatory decision-making can range from pharmacovigilance studies, such as post-approval safety studies or post-marketing requirements, to defining the unmet medical need for which a new therapeutic is being evaluated, to building applications such as external control studies for single-arm trials, or in situations where randomization could be challenging. Finding real-world data that is research-ready and of adequate quality is important for its potential use in regulatory decision-making. Generation of real-world data and evidence can be thought of to be part of an ecosystem where stakeholders across the board are utilizing real-world data within their own remit and can lead to a qualitative real-world data or evidence generation. In absence of reliable sources of real-world data, it may be a viable option to consider foreign sources of real-world data when appropriate. Many of the pivotal trials are global trials involving enrollment across many regions. Yet studies with true global representation are only a few. When considering evidence from pivotal clinical studies, a regulator will be interested in assessing how the evidence from the pivotal study can be generalized to the patient population in their own geography. In such cases, approaches from clinical epidemiology may include comparison of patient characteristics between the trial and the local population, evaluating trends such as through subgroup analyses pertaining to a specific region or country in the trial data, and identification of treatment effect modifiers. Some examples where race or ethnicity has been known to be a risk factor or an effect modifier are as follows. In the US, sickle cell disease affects approximately 10,000 Americans. It occurs among about 1 in every 365 African American births and among 1 in every 16,300 Hispanic American births. Stomach cancer incidence is disproportionately high among Asians, including Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese. In terms of effect modification, treatment of hypertension is commonly known to have effect modification that is associated with one's race. The angiotensin converting enzyme, or the ACE inhibitors, as well as the angiotensin receptor blockers, or the ARBs, are known to be more effective in white populations. In many cases, one can think of race or ethnicity as a crude proxy rather than being a scientific category of its own, and in fact, part of a social construct. Self-reported race or ethnicity may not account for the heterogeneity that is prevalent among contemporary societies with mixed ancestries. Therefore, effect modification due to racial or ethnic differences, in fact, could be a representation of a complex interaction between intrinsic and extrinsic factors. Access to healthcare, as well as physician and patient behavior, are part of such social construct and may not be accurately reflected in a single variable when assessing effect modification. The ICH E5 guideline provides guidance with respect to regulatory and development strategies that will permit adequate evaluation of the influence of the ethnic factors while minimizing duplication of clinical studies and supplying medicine expeditiously to patients for their benefit. Appendix A of this guideline shows the classification of intrinsic and extrinsic ethnic factors. The intrinsic factors are categorized into genetic and physiological and pathological conditions. A person's gender, race, or a particular genetic polymorphism necessary for the drug's metabolism are examples of genetic factors. The person's age or other coexisting diseases or organ functions are examples of physiological or pathological factors. Other factors, such as the height or the ADME receptor sensitivity, are examples of intrinsic factors that can be thought of as a combination of the genetic and physiological pathological factors. The extrinsic factors are mostly environmental, such as the climate, or socioeconomic factors, including educational status, as well as medical practice, definition of a disease, and the therapeutic approach, and even regulatory environment in which medicines are made available to the patients. A few other factors specific to lifestyle, such as smoking habits or alcohol consumption, as well as food habits and stress levels, can also be thought as combinations of various intrinsic as well as extrinsic factors. Appendix B of the ICH E5 guideline provides a helpful algorithm for assessment of the available clinical data package with foreign data that may include data from clinical trials and, in many cases, real-world data for acceptability of a regulatory decision. The first question that can be asked about such a data package is whether the existing data package meets the regulatory requirements. The next question is whether extrapolation of foreign data in the given data package is appropriate in the new region. Depending upon the answers to these questions, the need for further clinical studies can be determined for acceptability of the given clinical data package in the new region. The final outcome of this assessment may suggest no additional studies and acceptability of the data package as is for the regulatory decision in the new region, or alternatively, need for bridging and/or additional clinical studies. Considerations for extrapolation of clinical evidence are also applicable for real-world data as they are for clinical trials, and collectively, this makes the regulatory evidence package. In absence of well-established evidence regarding the race, ethnicity, or any other demographic factors being effect modifiers, foreign real-world data that meets the quality requirements and scientific rigor from a regulatory perspective may be considered to inform a regulatory decision to provide the necessary context to the evidence from clinical trials. And we have already heard from Gracie and Alex, as well as Christopher, about the quality of that is required in such real-world data evidence. Methodological considerations for foreign real-world data. When thinking about methodological considerations when using real-world data, the first consideration will be to determine whether the given indication has been previously shown to have effect modification, or if the existing pivotal data suggest presence of a trend or effect modification associated with race, ethnicity that can be attributable to a certain region or geography or presence of a biomarker. Additionally, potential effect modification can also be evaluated when using foreign real-world data, such as through sensitivity analyses. For example, when using real-world data, say from the United States, as a benchmark for a global single-arm trial, the sensitivity of the effect estimate can be assessed by restricting the trial data to patients who were enrolled in the US. If the practice patterns in other regions are significantly different than in the US, and therefore impacting the outcomes of patients in those regions, then the real-world data from the US may not be able to provide a relevant benchmark. It will be important to be mindful of a couple additional considerations. In case of a large, substantial treatment effect, extrapolation of foreign real-world data may be safer than in situations where the treatment effect is only marginal. Secondly, the context always matters, as we have heard previously. When the foreign real-world data is being considered to draw direct conclusions regarding the treatment effect, such as from an external control, then caution is warranted when using foreign real-world data for the external control. Oops. In the spirit of making efficient regulatory decisions when it matters, many regulators have evolved the requirements for necessary evidence package. Recently, we have known the Chinese health authorities to have strict requirement about Chinese data. However, recently they have created a special channel for fast-track approval of foreign drugs in case of urgent medical needs. The sponsor may achieve sensitivity analyses specific to ethnicity by demonstrating that the drug is safe and effective for use in Chinese populations if the drug has already been approved and marketed in countries like Japan, Hong Kong, Macau, or Taiwan, and is supported by sufficient clinical data. Next, I will like to bring some examples for considerations. The first one is risdiplam for spinal muscular atrophy. Spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, is a debilitating, progressive neuromuscular condition that impacts quality of life and survival. It is a rare genetic condition affecting 1 in 10,000 persons and is caused by a deficiency of SMN protein that leads to muscle weakness and loss of motor function. A natural history study for SMA was conducted. The study was initiated by a research institute in France and supported by Roche. It was a prospective multi-center study designed to characterize the natural course of SMA in untreated patients with later onset SMA. The study was conducted in patients from France, Belgium, and Germany. This natural history study was used as part of the external control to demonstrate the benefit of risdiplam in late onset SMA, which was part of the filing dossier to regulatory agencies. Risdiplam is now approved by regulatory authorities in 7 countries, including the US, Chile, Brazil, India, Ukraine, South Korea, and Georgia, and reviews are ongoing in 20 other countries. The next example I would like to mention is the SCHOLAR-1 study that was considered in approval of CAR-T therapy in relapsed or refractory DLBCL. SCHOLAR-1 study established a benchmark for refractory DLBCL patients and has been referenced by regulatory authorities in the US as well as Europe for the approval of CAR-T therapies. SCHOLAR-1 study combined 2 real-world data sets from the US with 2 large historical clinical trials to conduct a patient-level analysis to describe the outcomes in the refractory DLBCL patients. At the time of approval of CAR-T therapies, evidence was lacking to provide context from the target population, and the SCHOLAR-1 study helped establish a descriptive benchmark against which the evidence from single-arm trials of CAR-T therapies could be evaluated. In addition to those examples, I would also like to point out few examples from post-approval regulatory decisions. There have been many examples from post-approval settings where foreign real-world data has been considered for regulatory decisions. The first one is when data from US obtained from Flatiron was accepted by EMA to update the label of adotrastuzumab emtansine for use in breast cancer patients who have lower left ventricular ejection fraction. The second example I would like to point out is use of Flatiron data, which was also included in the filing dossier for entrectinib for its label expansion in patients with ROS1 fusion positive, locally advanced or metastatic non-small cell lung cancer. Flatiron US real-world data was accepted by Japanese Health Authority, PMDA, for entrectinib's label expansion. Regulatory health authorities globally have accepted real-world evidence from pregnancy registries to fulfill post-approval requirements across many approved treatments. Real-world data and evidence generated from real-world data complement the evidence generated from clinical trials that may or may not have representation from the region where a regulatory decision is being made. It's important to keep in mind that something is better than nothing. When complementary real-world data with acceptable quality from the same region is not available, foreign real-world data could provide additional relevant evidence to inform the regulatory decision. Ultimately, a comprehensive evidence package will lead to efficient decision-making and in achieving the vision to protect and promote the health of the population. I would like to thank everyone for your attention, and that's all from me.
Perfeito, muito obrigada, RWE. pela sua apresentação. Acho que agora podemos abrir para as perguntas. Fiquem à vontade, por favor. Temos uma aqui no chat. Como é realizada a dataficação e a reutilização de tudo? Todos os tipos de dados estruturados e não estruturados. Exemplo, PDF, voz, GPS e outros tipos de dados não padronizados. As agências reguladoras internacionais trabalham com RWD, Spark, MS, Azure, computação em blockchain aplicados a dados clínicos.
Could somebody repeat the question? Thank you.
Claro. Como é realizada a dataficação e a reutilização de tudo? Todos os tipos de dados estruturados e não estruturados. Exemplo, PDF, voz, GPS e outros tipos de dados não padronizados. As agências reguladoras internacionais trabalham com RWD, Spark, MS, Azure.
So I'm happy to start. So I'll address the last part first, and then I'll move on. I think, the international regulatory agencies, I think there is, at the moment, I think, there isn't, they're still evolving in their thinking around real-world data. There is obviously a lot of agencies that are very advanced. So for instance, as you saw from Alex's presentation when he showed the US FDA framework. So, the framework has been in place since 2018, but they actually, the finalized version, if you like, is going to be available in October. So there's still a gap between, what was the framework and what will be finally agreed. So, and the US are actually very advanced in this area of real world data. Now, EMA actually have a slightly different perspective in that they're very, very keen to drive the registry use. So, the reason for bringing out these two agencies is every agency is kind of looked into its own country in order to be able to see, should I focus on registry data? Should I focus on EHR? So that's something that's kind of driving all the international regulatory agencies' positions. And so they're developing their own positions. I mean, China has 6 regulatory guidance procedures that it brought out in 2020. Health Canada have actually, they have a framework that they've drafted with the HTA body because they feel you cannot approve, you need approval as well as reimbursement. So you can see there are different perspectives emerging as well. So the reason for mentioning all of this is that I think international agencies are still understanding how to work with real world data, and the sort of technologies that you mentioned are actually further along the line. And so there isn't so much, I would say, that particular area of machine learning, blockchain, all of that is still evolving. I think what's interesting in terms of blockchain is that in Asia, there's a lot of interest in sort of thinking about blockchain for manufacturing. So it may not be sitting in the space of real world data, but there is an opportunity to kind of consider techniques such as blockchain for other regulatory purposes as well. So I hope that kind of answers your question, but please feel free to elaborate more.
And I can add a little bit, Gracie, to just building on what you said, just from the US perspective and some experience that we have had with respect to engaging early with a regulatory agency to describe the data source. And in many ways, we deal with chart abstraction and data collection from primary data collection efforts like registries, and they do accept that level of evidence, and some of that work can leverage new technologies as well. So as long as we have good transparency, traceability, and there's some good, as you mentioned, there's some good guidelines as well with Duke Margolis on data quality and traceability for regulatory purposes that we can also learn from. But I think from my takeaway, it's to engage very early with the regulators about the nature of the data and what needs to be done to make sure that we have comprehensive capture of the data elements that we need. So if that's really, I think that's related to the question too, just building on what you said.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alex. And actually, you reminded me that the US have actually a specific channel. So there is a real world evidence committee that you can consult. And the advice is not non-binding, because, you know, when you think about how you interact with regulators, there are very specific meetings, you know, type C meeting, type B meeting, but this real world evidence committee, you can consult them and at any point. And as Alex mentioned, you know, going in early might be really beneficial, because they might tell you, you know, the quality is not, this is what we're looking at in terms of quality. So if there's an opportunity for ANVISA to think about building such a channel, that would be really, really, really helpful and well received by the sponsors.
And another piece that we can also demonstrate in advance is if we're using technology to help curate and abstract from unstructured data, we can do some validation studies and demonstrate what the data looks like without that process and what the data looks like with a manual process, so that there's an appreciation of where the technology comes in. So that's something easy that can be achieved, I think, too.
Yeah, and I can add, we've had discussion with also with FDA on our registries and making sure that the capturing algorithms, the adjudication of hard endpoints, and the availability for inspections, if we submit all those, the standards has not been lowered compared to any other data. But of course, the understanding and the methodology and the capabilities of an inspector or reviewer does increase to embrace these type of new data. But we are having the discussions. Some, like the Oxford study, that is through Oxford's technology. I don't have details of how that is, but it's a very robust natural NHA system in UK. And for using patient data and apps, we are building in-house tool apps and so forth, where we really have focus on the security and interlinking with our standard databases so that it can be submitted. But it is a completely different technology and things to think of. So some is built in-house, some is captured by partners, but all has to be made available for authorities.
Yeah, and if I could just mention, always it comes down to the quality of the real-world data and how early the sponsors could engage with the regulatory authorities. So irrespective of data, whether it's coming from registries or these even further advanced sources like the ones mentioned in the question, it's always, first of all, to be confident about the quality of the evidence that is being generated and the engagement with health authorities when the sponsors are thinking of including such evidence in their package.
And I think just to build on that, I mentioned a data dictionary in one of my slides, and this is one of the tools that we have in order to be able to look at, to at least understand how the data is organized. But it's a little bit of a fine balance between having enough data to look to see what the data may do, so then you can do your pre-specified protocol, to having all of the data. Because if you have all of the data, then you risk sort of saying that, well, doing the analysis and kind of having the result before you even get to the protocol point. So yeah, these sort of tools are available, but we also have to be cautious about how we use them as well. So yeah, just wanted to flag that as well.
Muito obrigada. Mais uma pergunta aqui no chat. Como as autoridades regulatórias, como FDA e EMA, estão avaliando o cumprimento em relação a data abstraction e data curation, e como essa avaliação se relaciona com o data package fornecido pelas empresas?
I'm happy to go, unless anyone else wants to jump in. Alex, did you want to, or Christopher, did you want to? Okay, so I think in terms of assessing, the data package and what we submit, and this is where we talked about a little bit about source verification. It really, I think it depends on what your data is answering. So if your data is being used for an efficacy claim, then you want to be able to show that you've had all the data checks done, that you've been able to, that there is some verification, that you've done some validation checks, because it's essentially a claim that you're making. If the data is supportive, if you like, if the data is used for understanding the natural history, if the data is used for understanding, what's the prevalence in the population, then, you may not need the same rigor as you would in order to be able to source verify. I'll give you a sort of tangible example that we've kind of grappled with in one of our studies. So in one of our studies, we used progression-free survival in oncology as an endpoint. Now, what's interesting about progression-free survival is it's captured in clinical trials. So, and it's captured easily. It's a RECIST-based criteria. So for those of you who don't know, RECIST is a specific method that you use to sort of build an endpoint. And this RECIST-based criteria is kind of standard in clinical trials. When you try to then understand what PFS looks like in the real world, there is no progression-free survival. You don't capture, you don't do radiographic image analysis at regular intervals of 6 weeks or 8 weeks. So you don't build a RECIST criteria. So you have to have some sort of adaptability. You have to then say, well, actually, what I can do is extract progression from the medical notes of a clinician. So then that becomes not a true endpoint, because it's progression that's extracted from what the physician has observed and not from radiography. So you want to be able to then say, well, how am I going to build that bridge? I need the radiographic images, I need all that data extracted. So these are the sort of steps you want to walk through in order to be able to see, what is the data used for? Is the data really important? Like, for instance, is it useful specifically for an efficacy claim, or is it supportive? I think you start with that point. And just to flag that palbociclib that Alex actually mentioned is an interesting example, because they had used overall response rate as an endpoint in their study, and overall response rate is not a typical endpoint that you get in real world databases. So they had to go in and they had to extract that, and they had to develop that as an endpoint. So it's a real, there has to be very careful thought. And this is where, what Alex mentioned about early communication, that plays a really important role when you're trying to decide how this data should be, what sort of data should be shared and how you want to be able to approach this. Sorry, it's a very long answer.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example that you mentioned with oncology, because when we're thinking about the right the right use case for real world evidence. It's not necessarily to provide a measure of RECIST or overall response rate. And that's what we also have to, as I mentioned, we have to communicate even within our peers in our companies as well, how best to use real world evidence. And you don't start off with a clinical trial manufactured endpoint in many ways, because at the end of the day, what we really care about are patients doing better, are they living longer? And we can measure different aspects related to what we're trying to measure with RECIST criteria. And the RECIST criteria, yeah, I think it is very challenging, because we would be missing, I think, 70% of the time information that we need. And when we do see the information that we need for patients who are getting regular scans in the real world, that's in and of itself biased, because that patient is suspected to have disease progression and therefore contributing a lot of data points, a lot of scans. And so we have to take these factors into account and sort of put them in the right context and position real world data in a way that it can be successful and fit for purpose. And I think that's on us as researchers to do that. But it is a challenge, because we do see, of course, examples where that thinking isn't there. And that would be my recommendation, is to really think about, is the data source suitable to answer that question?
Actually, if I could quickly mention another example from diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, which is still oncology. But however, the criteria to assess responses are not RECIST. It's a different set of criteria. We are talking hematological malignancies. But this whole field is definitely evolving. We are still probably yet far away from really getting those radiographic images at regular intervals from patients. But now we have seen a filing to the US FDA in DLBCL, where for a subset of patients, the sponsor was able to bring in the actual images and do a some sort of a validation study to assess the concordance between response data that was extracted from the records and then validating that against the response data from the images. FDA is still, I guess that was a step forward in terms of bringing the response data from real world into the filing package. We are still uncertain about the receptivity from FDA of this evidence, but I just wanted to point out that even this is further evolving in terms of what can be done from a real world data perspective. And the second thought I wanted to add here is that, again, speaking for FDA, in the space of oncology, the regulatory pathway has been quite established, even when you have single arm trials, where response rates are typically used as primary endpoints, and time to event endpoints are discouraged. And it's an interesting discovery that FDA actually asks for response-based endpoints in case of external controls, because they strongly believe patients in the real world are different from clinical trials, and therefore when you're assessing time to event endpoints, there could be multiple confounding factors that may not be appropriately accounted for in real world data. So it's overall pretty exciting or interesting to see where this field is evolving and how the regulatory agencies are being receptive of such evidence.
Ok, obrigada. Próxima pergunta. As agências reguladoras têm feito inspeções nesse tipo de dados como os registros?
I can start. So to EMA, we have submitted real-world data to remove restrictions from patients coming from different products to a fixed dose combination. And they reviewed the study report and the conclusions and did have questions. And some they found supportive of showing that it was safe to expand the population as it was being used that way in the real world. Others they said was not up to the standard. So EMA have reviewed the study protocols and what we submitted, and through question rounds have concluded on the various levels. So that's the level we have had, whereas the Oxford study is starting now, so we don't have any experience with inspections for a primary registry prospective designs.
Maybe I can add a bit, because I was actually involved in one of the pregnancy registries that I earlier referenced to in my presentation. This was a pregnancy registry for HER2 targeting treatments in breast cancer, and this was conducted as a prospective registry. So it's still observational study, but prospective data collection, and therefore the conduct of the study was very much in alignment with the expectations, exactly how prospective clinical trials are conducted. Operationally, the conducting of this registry was very similar to that. And then so there will be annual reports and all sorts of expectations from an operational perspective met in case of that registry.
And also maybe I can add, so we, Flatiron, the electronic health records company, is actually part of the Roche enterprise, and they regularly get inspected. They have audit trails. This was actually one of the things that kind of helps us understand what regulators are looking for. So yeah, there is a lot of inspections happening there.
Perfeito, obrigada. A aceitação de estudos envolvendo o RWD pelas agências regulatórias no mundo estão em diferentes fases. Qual seria a dica de vocês para acelerar o Brasil nessa jornada de aceitação de RWD?
I can start. I think it's engaging in the conversation and encouraging the dialogue before embarking on using real data for regulatory decision making. We have experience with using it for pre-approval, so going for a first indication, where first we had discussions with the FDA and agreed it can be used for the safety database, but it will not be contributing to the effectiveness. But even that value of bringing early insights to the safety of a new molecular entity will help patients get better informed, and also payers seeing data that they need relevant at time of launch. And then afterwards, we've gone to Japan and China and other agencies and actually gotten an agreement on a global setup, which actually surprised a little bit, but having that conversation with each agency has really helped us understand how we meet their task of securing that it's a safe and effective medicine we're bringing to the market. So early dialogue and discussing the details.
Another thing also to keep in mind is the specific situation where real world data is being considered. If the unmet medical need is so high where it is necessary to bring in that additional component, perhaps that might be the situations where such interactions could be more effective as compared to other situations where it's not necessarily challenging to conduct clinical trials.
I'm just putting my regulatory policy hat on to say that I think what it would be really great to have a real world evidence guideline from Anvisa to be able to say, well, these are the situations as Ashwini alluded to, there are, and that's what, similar to what the FDA have done, that, there are specific areas, rare diseases, orphan designations, pediatric diseases, where real world data can play a really important role, because we're not able to do your traditional RCTs. There is a huge problem with, because we've modeled this out in a rare disease in order to be able to recruit a small group of patients in a rare disease. It might take up to 12 years. And we don't have that time when we're accelerating drug development. So if there is an opportunity for Brazil to come up with their guideline on real world evidence, that would be very helpful. And hopefully, creating a pathway where we can directly have dialogue. I think Christopher has referred to it. We've all referred to it. A dedicated pathway in which you can discuss early. What's the pivotal study? What is the real world data bringing in? So an opportunity to discuss the totality of evidence that you're seeing. I think these are all initiatives that will be really welcome from an industry perspective.
Perfeito, temos mais uma pergunta. O que é mais comum? O RWE são utilizados para reportar os dados clínicos ou substituem esses estudos clínicos?
Yeah, so they currently, I'll take this on. I think they currently mostly support the clinical trial data. As I mentioned before, I think the FDA has said that most of their decisions of where real world evidence has been provided would have been made in the absence of that real world evidence. So the holy grail is really to have the opportunity to replace the need to do a clinical trial with, the real world data. But I think those instances are few and far between, and we have to be very thoughtful in the planning. As you heard, there's a lot of challenges with real world data when it comes to the quality and the representativeness and the right clinical environment. So I think we really have to think about those right use cases to demonstrate that we can substitute using real world data. But I pragmatic trials come to mind. But I think those are opportunities that aren't very common. I don't know if others want to comment on that.
Well, I just wanted, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go.
No, I just wanted to mention that the two terms I heard, and I know I'm hearing interpretation, but I heard reinforce versus replace. I think neither are currently welcome. I think for the foreseeable future, all regulatory agencies will look upon clinical trials and randomized clinical trials as the gold standard for generating evidence. So the role of real world data is really to complement what can be achieved from what is feasible through the clinical trial evidence, and therefore I actually could not relate with either of the words that were used.
And I think just to add a slightly different perspective as well, there is an opportunity for real world data in terms of drug repurposing. I mean, this is an area that many different health authorities have flagged that this is of interest. You may have heard about the Project Renewal from the FDA. Australian Health Authority have said that they're also interested in drug repurposing. Essentially, this is taking drugs that are already established in the market and adding on a new label. And this is an area where real world data can really, I think, help. And this is where, it makes sense to kind of switch it from this supportive evidence into the evidence where it might become the primary source of data. And I'm saying might because this is still being tested out. I think even in the case of palbociclib, where they used it for, where they used real world data for label expansion, it was still supported by the safety database, still came from their clinical trials. So it's a kind of, you kind of pick what you need in order to be able to drive this label expansion. But I think in the space of drug repurposing, I think there's a really interesting opportunity there that we are really keen to work with regulators on as well, because we feel this is right for patients as well. Because if there is an additional way in which the drug could benefit, in addition to the original way in which it was licensed, then that would be of benefit. So yeah, just wanted to add that perspective as well here.
And I guess it also depends what we're calling clinical trials. So if we're talking about post-authorization clinical trials that we may need to conduct, phase 4 trials, that there are opportunities where real world data can really help inform on safety. And we have a lot of activities using databases rather than creating a whole new effort that's primary collection. And then of course, as Christopher was mentioning too, there are opportunities to work within the infrastructure that's built by registries to kind of recruit individuals and collect data for a clinical trial,
Perfeito. Obrigada. Temos mais perguntas? Quem quiser abrir os microfones também, fiquem à vontade, mas aqui no chat se encerraram.
Então, eu gostaria mais uma vez de agradecer pela participação de todos, né, uma audiência grande, e aos speakers também que gentilmente cederam esse seu tempo para compartilhar com a gente as suas experiências. Muito obrigado mais uma vez, uma boa semana a todos.